Welcome, everybody. It's really great to have you here today, whatever your time zone may be in London, Chicago, or the west coast of the US, or even some parts of Asia. Um, it is very wonderful to have our speakers here today for Vastari's roundtable discussion today. It's quite a topical subject that we're going to be discussing on this webinar. It's about identifying Chinese diaspora within Asian art. This is a topic that's even more poignant today, given the circumstances politically, and of course, given the recent lockdown and events around Wuhan, that there has been a lot of discourse that has resonated with people, perhaps not always in the best way. So we've invited two very esteemed speakers to discuss this issue with us here today. We have Inez Suen and Gordon Cheung, who will be discussing the subject with me today. Just a little bit more about who I am. My name is Bernadine Brocker. I'm the CEO of Vastari, and we help connect different people around the world for exhibitions, including in China and in other parts of the world. And we have invited Inez and Gordon here today for this discussion. So let's just step right into the discourse. I would love to start with looking at each of your careers within the art world and looking at how you got into the art world. So maybe we can start with you, Inez. Could you tell us a little bit more about your career in the art world, what you do now, how you've gotten to that point, etc.?
Well, my career in the art world, well, thank you first, Bernadine, for having me on here. And I guess I should give a little bit background about myself, and that my background is actually all in design. I have my undergraduate in industrial design, and then I went and I tried to pursue a master's degree in the history of design. And at the time, there were only two programs that even touched on the subject. And one was at the V&A in London, and the other one was in New York at the Cooper Hewitt. And it was the program of the history of decorative arts and design. And it was a great program, and I had a lot of fun learning about museums and things like that. But I never could find a job in that avenue of the world. So I started freelancing. And because I have a technical arts background, I started to work for artists because they needed help and I needed part-time work. And so I started freelancing for different kinds of artists. And then after a while, I realized I was never going to find a job in the decorative arts. So I transitioned to becoming an arts consultant, like a producer for artists. And then later, more of a business consultant for different arts organizations, artists, and galleries, and things like that. And so it was all by accident.
Tell us a little bit more about the ICFAC as well.
The ICFAC is an organization that my parents actually started, I want to say like 20 years ago, because they've always been involved in the nonprofits in the arts in Chicago amongst the Chinese community. You know, my dad was the director of our summer camp. They started an organization 40 years ago called the CFAS, Chinese Fine Arts Society, where they hold a international competition to learn Chinese music every year, and it's still ongoing. And then they started ICFAC. Originally, it was also music focused, but as I started to develop this art career, people came to me and were like, "Oh, what do you know about Asian art? What do you know about Chinese art? You know, here, I have a bunch of Chinese art. Can you sell it?" And I was like, I have no background in this, none whatsoever. I better start learning, you know, because I felt somewhat ashamed. It's my culture, you know, but I grew up in the West and we don't have much of that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that subject later on in this discussion. So I guess before we go deeper into the cultural aspects, Gordon, could you tell us a little bit more about how you became an artist? Have you always wanted to be an artist? Tell us more.
Yeah, I always wanted to be an artist. It was the one certainty in my life that I wanted to pursue. It was only later on that I realized that not everyone knows exactly what they wanted to do, but I did. It was the clearest path before me. Partly because I was terrible at school for many years, and the only good thing that I was good at was making art. And so I ended up in Central St. Martin's, graduated from there in '98, and then the Royal College in 2001. So I'm a British-born artist, and after graduating from the Royal College and having a look, well, actually, I had a look around the art galleries when I was in the second year of my BA, thinking that I could choose which gallery I would like to belong to in my naivety. And I realized that, having looked through the lists of all the different artists in those galleries, that there weren't any artists with any Chinese names amongst them. So I realized I needed to step up, and I started organizing a lot of exhibitions, and all the way through, leading up to the largest one at the Royal College during my first year, which ended up involving 172 artists in 2 disused Victorian school buildings. And since then, I've decided not to organize any more shows after that event. And luckily, through being invited into other shows through peers and a cumulative effect, ending up in a residency at the Chinese Art Centre, now called the CFCCA in Manchester. Some curators saw my work and put me into one of the most important shows in the UK calendar, the British Art Show.
Wow. And you mentioned to me before that the British Art Show hadn't had many Asian artists before, or Asian heritage artists, right? I think it was only one person.
In over 30, maybe over 30 years of its history, I think there's maybe one artist of Asian descent in their list. It's a type of exhibition from which, every year, it happens every 5 years, and when it does happen, it's like many of those artists that then some of those artists get nominated for the Turner Prize, which of course is another famous art competition, I suppose, and in the UK calendar again. So it's something that's seen in high regard, and yeah. So there's been maybe one, of East Asian of descent, at least, anyway. So yeah, which is an indication, I think, of something,
Yeah, such a significant minority within British culture not being represented in British art is, of course, impactful. And it also can affect people's ambitions, right? As you mentioned, you probably had the opposite feeling. You thought, wow, there aren't enough names there. We need to get in there. But others might feel a bit discouraged by not identifying themselves in that group. Do you think?
Could you rephrase that?
Sorry, yeah, maybe I'm being a bit unclear. What I mean is, sometimes seeing a gap in the market can actually drive you to want to be there, and sometimes it can actually make you feel discouraged because of the fact that you're not represented, and so that makes you feel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think artists, they choose to become artists because they're compelled and they have a profound reason for being an artist. That's what drives them forward. But then reality sort of comes, crashing towards you. And when you start to see the landscape before you, through which you're going to have to navigate your art career, whatever that means, or however you understood that, you can see some of the obstacles before you. And then you sort of step up and, organize exhibition, or you find a route, through it. To be discouraged, then it can be, I guess, but then also it's really important to recognize what is the types of opportunities that are before you, and whether you actually need to consciously build, towards it, or actually, to make it happen yourself, such as organizing your own shows, etc.
Exactly. That's really impressive, to kind of want to make a difference. And I'm going to shift the question again a little bit more in this introductory phase to talk a little bit about positioning Chinese diaspora as a concept. If someone asks either of you where you are from, what is your answer usually?
it depends. It really depends on who's asking. I often get this question in the back of a New York taxi cab. And I'm not so nice. But often, actually, that question comes from other immigrants because they want to connect and they want to know, where are you really from? You know, because we are all part of a Chinese diaspora. And my family, a long time ago, immigrated from China to Taiwan and then to the United States. So that's what they're asking. But ultimately, yeah, if you're the creepy taxi driver, I'm going to tell you to probably F off.
Gordon, is it the same feeling for you?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it is a very, you know, it's a question out of curiosity, right? It's kind of, you know, they want to know where you're from because of the way that you look. You know, they may be wanting to empathize or reach out to, you know, a similar conversational something to converse about. But the question, in a way, has something implicit in it, which is that you don't belong in this, you know, culture in a way. You know, there's that sort of aspect to it, and you know, there's this idea that actually you don't really belong here. You belong elsewhere. You know, and I think people of a diaspora sort of origin, if you like, is constantly in this kind of in-between state of different identities. But this can be positive as well as, you know, as well as what could be, you know, negative, you know, depending on how that question is framed and the agenda behind it. And but the positivities is that, you know, obviously diaspora sort of people of diaspora, they come from two different cultures. They can bridge, you know, between these cultures. You know, this is to increase communication, you know, between understanding as well. To prevent, you know, a kind of didactic way of understanding, you know, another race, if you like. So, you know, it's like Inez says, you know, it depends on the context of the question.
And I guess looking at it, this just immediately makes me think about why we're doing this, why we're having this conversation. It is about kind of sometimes the misunderstandings of diaspora artists, but also how it could potentially be a link towards Asian art. You're describing almost being a bridge and helping with one foot in each on each side. That's a productive way of looking at it. And have you felt that at certain moments in your career, maybe that has happened, that you've seen yourself go further because you had a foot in both cultures?
I hope so. That's, I mean, I can't like have concrete examples, if you like, of having sort of changed someone's mind or something, you know, about China or something, you know, but just by simply being an artist of diaspora origin, if you like, you know, is you're already sort of, I guess, making by inherently, you know, a sort of statement of being in between. And that is certainly what a lot of my work is seeks to be about, you know, in a kind of positive way, to try and bridge those sorts of divides, if you like, particularly in this climate as well. So my last solo exhibition at Idela Santi was about a lot about the infrastructural projects of China, and trying to demystify the sort of didactic, sort of grand narratives, if you like, of good versus evil, communism versus democracy, and actually look at the economic miracles, you know, that have happened. So I remember like someone asking me about how they felt, how did I feel about China's infrastructural projects? I said, well, you know, 800 million people lifted from poverty, more infrastructure built than the world history combined altogether. And then his response was, yeah, it's terrifying. And I was really like surprised, you know, because what it was that when he pushed me to ask whether I was terrified, I said, well, you know, I guess it depends on whether you feel threatened, you know, existing in a culture through which you have benefited from empire and colonization and the resources that have been extracted as a result, and this type of privilege and entitlement of within that culture through which they have dominated the world, and seeing a rising power, on the horizon, being and often sort of bracketed as being a superpower or a next superpower. And of course, you're primed, your mind is primed, to see it negatively, despite the empirical evidence that, 800 million people lifted out of poverty in a matter of decades. It's a pretty big achievement,
But having grown up in the US and in the UK, you will have been raised in the educational system that does teach that way of thinking about things. So how did you feel growing up around that narrative?
I just thought it was really strange. Because I'm an immigrant. I immigrated when I was 8 years old to the United States from Taiwan, and suddenly there was nothing about Chinese history, Chinese anything in the curriculum. I mean, I was just at the time trying to learn English, but when I got to high school and I got a command of the language, I petitioned year after year to the school board to include world history. I wasn't even just petitioning for Chinese history, I was petitioning for world history, because I remember I went to the school board in high school and pointed to a map and said, but what about all these different places like Africa and Asia and all these places? When are we going to learn about them? Isn't that the world? So, I mean, it's a systemic issue in our education system, and it's going to take a lot, I think, of effort to change.
Yeah, so my education was obviously in Britain, in England, and the world, or the definition of the world, wasn't inclusive of China in my education, so much. It was kind of like, it was barely mentioned. It felt like a footnote. And so I grew up thinking that China was this sort of insignificant, sort of, barely mentioned nation. I didn't realize, that it was like 1/5 of the world's population, and that it has over 5,000 years of history, etc. And it was only later on that I learned all of this sort of stuff by myself. In my English education, there was it was all about discovering the new world, and it was all about colonial conquest. In many ways, slavery was barely mentioned, as anything of particular significance. The dark aspects of colonialism was barely mentioned. Opium Wars, was that ever mentioned in my education? I don't remember. I don't think so. And that's something that I've actually been learning about, more recently, and being really very interested in exploring, particularly with the current instigated U.S. trade war, with China, and these are incredibly important sort of histories to understand our current histories as well.
Yeah, and I guess that transitions really nicely into kind of one of the instigators of this webinar was an event that you hosted called Dim Sum Dialogues, that was as a result of recent events and a feeling that there was some racism prevalent in the art world particularly, but also as a result of the wider political situation. Inez, could you tell us a little bit more about what instigated that roundtable discussion and how it went?
I instigated that discussion because of COVID-19. I think there was just the statistics, I think just last week came out from CBS News that said over 2,000 anti-Asian American hate incidences were recorded just between March and June. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty more that didn't go reported. And this is nothing new. It's just that now there's somebody recording it finally. So, so there was a lot of discussions. I had a lot of young Asian American artists kind of coming to me, talking to me about it. And then I started just talking to people, and I realized it was like kind of a timely manner. And what's interesting about our Dim Sum Dialogues at the time was that it happened the same week that George Floyd was, you know, brutally murdered. And it kind of sparked this like movement from a lot of it. It just became even more timely of a discussion, is that, you know, it's a systemic problem, and that they've been, you know, pitching Blacks and Asians against each other in the Western world for centuries. You know, because a lot of that came out during the post-COVID-19 era.
Yeah, and it wasn't only Chinese diaspora, people of Chinese diaspora descent. I keep making this a very long term. We're gonna have to find a quicker way of saying it, but it was basically anyone that looked different that was targeted through this. This
Koreans, Japanese, just like the Chinese were targeted during the Japanese internment. You know, similarly, you know, they put Asians all in one group. But, you know, ultimately...
And then, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's the same thing also that China is such a big country, and there are so many different Chinese people that if you generalize, it's
absolutely. Yeah. For example, there's 55 ethnic Chinese groups in China outside of Han Chinese, which makes up the majority. For example, Gordon is Han Chinese. I am not at all Han Chinese, but yet we're identified as the same culture. And he grew up in Britain. I mostly grew up in the United States. His family immigrated from Hong Kong. Mine came through Taiwan. Totally different.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things that people need to know. You know, that China is being Chinese is a cultural thing. Being from China is a national thing. And being from Taiwan is a national thing. Being from, you know, all of these different places is a national thing. Being Chinese is a cultural thing. And there's millions of people, I believe there's 5 million overseas Chinese just in the US alone. The biggest population is in Thailand with 10 million Chinese people. But I think oftentimes in the United States, especially in the art world, we don't think about that. We think of Chinese as China. And I think we just need to all be aware that there is this giant diaspora, and that the artists that are coming out of Taiwan or Hong Kong could also be Chinese.
Yes. Gordon, did you want to say something about that too?
I think Inez said that really, really well. So,
great.
Yeah,
But then I guess if we look at the discussions that you were having post COVID-19 and kind of how the discourse was oversimplified, do you think there are immediate solutions visible of what could be done in the art world, but also in the wider world, to improve the situation and to raise awareness about things like you were that you were saying, Inez?
I think what you're doing is very important. I think having these discussions and just talking about it, just talking to as many people, that's what we try to do with ICFAC, is we just try to talk about it as much as possible. You know, tell people our own stories, you know, share other people's stories, and actually just make people aware that there is a diaspora. I mean, ever since I started kind of going in this direction with the organization, I talk to people at events about Chinese diaspora, and I would say 60% of the time, more than half, people will say something to the effect of, "Oh, I didn't know there was a Chinese diaspora." And I'm always like, "Okay, well, let me tell you about it." And because it's such a normal thing for me, right? I am a part of different cultures, different minorities that make up a bigger nationality, I guess, cultural identity. And then on top of that, I got shifted over to the Western world, where I had to grow up in between two completely shifting philosophies. So yeah, I'm a big, because I can't identify with one.
You've also, I've read comments on your Instagram in which there are people really grateful, you know, for the information that you're also providing, you know, the histories, you know, that they didn't know about, you know, identities that they feel that belongs to them as well, that, you know, they weren't aware of until, you know, you had sort of written about them and posted about them. And so there's this sort of, you know, as much as there's people may not know what diaspora is, those that understand that they belong to it are also grateful for the histories that you have underlined helped sort of show, and I think those are really important things. These are stories, that are really important to who we are. They bind us to and root us in histories, and that's an incredibly important human experience. And in some ways, the arts provides a kind of educational platform, through which we can sort of project, this type of knowledge, and create forums, for people to feel that, yeah, my identity is valid, my history is important, and I really want to know more. I want to understand more about where I come from, where my family origins, etc. And so, diaspora, they can be this very important sort of bridge, between these cultures, these sort of conduits, of information, in order to further understanding between cultures.
And how do you feel about the fact that, Inez, you kind of referred to it earlier, that Chinese diaspora art often gets grouped into Asian art? So it was surprising that you were mainly European and American design and decorative arts specialist and not an Asian art specialist. How do you think that's a problem in the art world?
It's a problem, yeah. And to be honest, Chinese diaspora, we're not the biggest population. We're a big chunk of people, but we're not the biggest population, and we shouldn't have, 80% of curators being part of Chinese diaspora. But no, I don't think a lot of, just because of the systemic issue of our education, people just aren't aware there even is a diaspora. So I think that's the biggest problem. And yeah.
And I guess there are many museum representatives on this call, and it's of course a really interesting subject as well, that as a museum, if you're trying to reach local audiences and speak to people that are in your communities, actually working with the Chinese diaspora artists or art professionals, you might also reach Chinese diaspora communities that are in your area.
Yes, and Chinese diaspora is so vast. There's probably a Chinese community in your city. And there's probably Chinese artists in your city. Before you give Ai Weiwei another show, like look locally. It's expensive to ship Ai Weiwei stuff all the way from, I don't know, where's he in now, UK? Like look locally. There's great artists, of Chinese descent all over the world, and we're everywhere. And we shouldn't be a part of the Asian arts department necessarily, because I'm American. He's British. We should be.
Yeah. And I want to add to that, which is, we are in a very strange times, obviously, but also when the most powerful man in the world, with the most powerful nation, with all of the military behind, etc., is calling a virus China virus. This is dangerous rhetoric, and we have seen, previous fascistic leaders use this type of technique, and where history has shown us the consequences of such actions. So it's that much more important to be sort of highlighting, the understanding between cultures. And the diaspora sort of community are those that have understanding of both, and the museum world, they are there to create cultural narratives, to fix cultural narratives as well, and to be the conduits of, knowledge, and in this circumstance, in this moment, as America and the UK ramps up a Cold War with China, it's that much more important to create this type of dialogue and to highlight it and go, this is not a history that we want to see, once again. And that's why, the World Health Organization, determines that we do not call viruses, a nation or a race, for that reason, as well. So we have to try and help to dispel, some of the dangers that are on the horizon, and sort of ask ourselves, is this really what we want from our humanity? Is this really what we want from our culture? And to make a stand, and to point and go, hey, this isn't right. You know, this
Yeah.
is not what I want. You know, this is who I am. And this is who we are. You know, and you don't deserve to actually fix that narrative in the mindset of so many people.
Yeah, and you can nuance the narrative as someone who understands Chinese culture, but is not necessarily in China now, or has necessarily the links to China, that you can be nuanced in how you describe things so that it speaks to both, right? And can explain things in a more open way. And I think dispel the fear that really exists because of ignorance rather than because of actual fear. Do you think that there, have you seen examples, or have you had feelings of that it is changing, or that people are trying to, personally, I feel that the press hasn't been taking up the China virus nickname at all. And I think that that is one small way in which people are trying to resist what is happening. But have you seen other examples of positive change, or things that could be done?
Well, I think Fox News is obviously a big proponent of this.
Yes, okay. When I said the
Great.
press, maybe I was talking about.
But generally, perhaps, yeah, in the liberal media, you know, it's less so, you know. But then, you know, we have to also look at the political actions that are being enacted right now between the UK and the US, you know, with respect to taking themselves out of the extradition situation in Hong Kong, etc. And so yeah, it's a difficult situation, you know, in which hopefully there'll be positive outcomes as opposed to.
Well, one positive outcome has immediately been suggested by one of the attendees, saying that they're touring an exhibition about the relationship between Asian diasporas in Latin America and the Caribbean. So there we go, from 1945 to today. So that already helps a lot. We had one question from the chat that I thought was interesting. What are some resources, books, music, films, etc., you recommend to further delve into Chinese culture and history? So often I am afraid that the material I take in is whitewashed, but also I would just love to know what Chinese art has piqued your interest and felt freeing to learn more about. What do you think? Does anyone want to jump on that question?
Well, I mean, there's tons. I mean, I guess from a more, I would have to, I think about that. I could probably put together a list and maybe send it out to you guys to distribute later.
Yeah. I guess more from that question, what I was also reading into between the lines was a little bit about whitewashed Chinese culture and history. How, what are some terms or things that you can notice that then make you realize that, oh, okay, this is maybe not necessarily told in a way that is non-biased? Well, do you have any red flags?
I think overall communism is evil, bad, and ugly, right? And it's scary and all of that stuff, right? Yeah, so that's pretty much what we were taught.
Well, true, but also, Gordon, you were saying that a lot of people automatically, before this call, when we spoke, you said a lot of people automatically think if you are a Chinese diaspora that you are a communist. But actually, interestingly, a lot of people left China because they weren't communists. And that's actually probably Chinese diaspora communities have more to say about not being communist than about being communist. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, in a way, I kind of think is like I was saying about my last show in London at Ascenti. I was trying to almost dispel this didactic sort of discourse about communism versus democracy and look at actual political action, if you like, with how China has built all these enormous infrastructure projects, etc. And to look at like how many, what is the living conditions, if you like, of the majority of the people, you know, in those countries, rather than sort of like going, hey, they're all communists and therefore they're bad. and democracy is all about freedom and liberty. These are kind of very simplistic sort of romantic ideas. And I wanted to try and look at the sort of some of the more pragmatic sort of mechanisms of how you build a civilization and how you treat its people as well. So there's been a lot of what I read is from investigative journalists, such as those with Grey Zone and The Intercept. And I try to cross-reference sort of articles to discern some, as much of the truth as I can. And that has really helped me to sort of look at, for example, some of the geopolitical policies of the US in respect to China. So can you imagine like 400 Chinese bases surrounding America right now? You know, it's an impossible scenario, right? But that is the reality of China. You know, it's and once you sort of start to see all of these, you know, chess pieces, if you like, of the situation, and then the longer roots of the histories that I then, you know, find out on documentaries on YouTube or something like that, you know, and you start to sort of like develop a different picture that's beyond these romantic narratives of communism versus democracy, liberty, you know, versus authoritarianism or something, you know. I mean, look at the way how COVID-19 was discussed, you know, draconian measures by China in lockdown, you know, and then what did the West do? You know, it's, yes, they're draconian as well. I don't know, you know, it's kind of, but maybe because it's a democratic kind, it's okay. You know, it's this sort of, these kind of contradictions, you know, these kind of cognitive dissonances, you know, in the mind that prevents one from looking at things as more objectively, as opposed to the easier route, which is this sort of romantic sort of notion of, democratic ideals versus communist ideals. So yeah, it's I think you just search for the best sources of information that you can, while also reading, you know, some of the what I would term as propaganda as well.
Yeah, which exists on both sides, right? So
Absolutely, absolutely.
read
Yeah.
between the lines on both in both cultures.
Yeah, I don't want to like say that just because right now I sound like this, that I'm maybe defending China or something, you know, that no, I enjoy democracy and I like the ability to be able to vote for my leader, you know, but I want to look at things, you know, kind of in a geopolitical light, and to understand that there are many mechanisms here beyond, you know, the democracy versus communism, good versus evil narrative. That actually there's a long-standing geopolitical game being enacted by civilizations right now with a long-standing history, such as I said before, such as the Opium War that led to the Hong Kong being ceded to the UK, and they never gave democracy to Hong Kong people other than 2 years prior to handover, and now they're going, Hong Kong deserves democracy, you know, as if they're coming in to as savior or something, you know, and now they're enacting these policies that are going to be damaging to Hong Kong's people, you know, but once again, you know, the narratives of good versus evil is so strong that it blinds one to the actual geopolitics that are being played as well.
Yeah, and the nuances of the motives behind each side and what's happening. I think there's a really interesting question that's just been kind of collaboratively posed on our chat. So there, what the question is in addition to explaining the diasporic experience to non-Chinese people, how do you explain the Chinese diasporic experience to people in China who may not realize that we are also part of the Chinese narrative? How do you feel about your narrative as it is seen in China?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. I think diaspora has a really big meaning, right? I think we talk about diaspora here as being kind of like Gordon says, in between the East and the West. And there's also diaspora within Asia, of course, you know, the Chinese from Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, you know, Korea. And I think that diaspora itself is its own thing. And as well as the diaspora within China, and that it's made up of 55 ethnic minorities. So I want to say thank you to all the people actually from Asia actually staying up to watch this. And maybe we could do this discussion there at their time zone, you know, at a more timely time, so we can give them exposure and explain. My Chinese isn't so great, but it's all right.
Yeah. I guess that's a very good point. We definitely chose a Western time zone for this discussion right now, but we will be recording it and publishing it on, well, YouTube, which may not be accessible on in some locations. But yes, hopefully we will get more of this discussion going. Gordon, do you think that your work speaks to a Chinese audience?
Well, I had a solo exhibition in Shanghai, and a journalist insisted that there was no Chinese aspect to my work, you know, that it's very Western. Funnily enough, in the West, you know, quite often it's one of the first things that they sort of maybe talk about in my work. I say, oh yes, he's of Chinese descent, and you can see this, you know, and so on. So you can't help these things other than to keep going, keep showing, you know, and try to sort of change the narrative, if you like, the perception that just by being of Chinese descent, I guess, you know, in some ways makes your work inherently, in some ways, you know, Chinese as well as being Western. Like Inez says, you know, we belong to a kind of in-between space, and that can be very powerful. I think it's not that we necessarily belong to either or, but actually both at the same time, and that's a really positive, I think, stance from which, like I said, it can be the conduit of knowledge and understanding.
And I guess that there's a difficulty in today's world that we're all doing everything on databases. So there has to be a field of what nationality you are and where you're from and that type of thing, and that people then define who you are. Do you feel that ambiguity is in all of your work, or sometimes you do work that might be more Western or work that is more Chinese? And then would you, how do you look at your works? Are there some that, you know, how someone describes that you can definitely see that there is a Chinese influence in your work or something? Is it that you purposely are trying to reference that visual, those visual triggers, or is it actually something that is subconscious and that you wouldn't be able to divide?
I do specifically look at certain bodies of work. So, for example, I was responding after 2008, the first financial crisis, trying to look at the first economic bubble, and that led me to the Dutch Golden Age. And then from there, that was the birth of modern capitalism and the first economic bubble, and also globalization as well, the East India Trade Company. And then that led me towards looking at still life imagery from there, from the Rijksmuseum. And I used an algorithm to blur it in order to question fixed narratives of histories written by victors. So in a way, I was suggesting that in some ways, this is culture being a propaganda tool, you know, in that it's defining a certain type of history that whitewashes some of the darker aspects of colonization, militarized trade routes, etc. And then that led me to looking at eventually towards the Opium Wars, and then from there I hope most of us understand what happened to China as a result of that. And
you use the word glitch, which I guess makes you think that it was a mistake that needs to be fixed, or a temporary failure of the equipment somehow.
So there's a subculture of artists who really appreciate the aesthetics of the glitch. The glitch is obviously considered to be a mistake in technology, but what happens with the glitch is that you simultaneously see that you're looking at the screen, as well as understanding that there's been a rupture in the reality or illusion of what you're looking at. And in that moment, in that perceptive moment, that space that opens up before you, there's a question. You can question the narratives that are enfolded into that space. And so the types of images that I choose are specific to ask a question about those histories that are being determined by who exactly and from what agenda.
So kind of that moment where you suddenly step back and see it differently. And
you see that there's a broken illusion of an image, but also the mechanical reproduction of the image as well. So you've got these different sort of multiple layers, you know, in the work as a result of the rupturing by the glitch. The glitch is actually done by an algorithm that reorganizes the pixels, but it doesn't destroy copy over them. It reorders them. So for me, it's this metaphor of a new order. You know, it's this kind of this notion that a history isn't fixed; it's actually in flux, and that the types of understandings that you can bring to it can help to make that history more liquid. You know, in that now you can understand it and comprehend it past the agendas of those that have written it from the position of a victor.
yes. I just want to take a moment to absorb that, because that was completely on point on what all of these recent discussions, including the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the things that have been happening recently, are about addressing these issues and being able to identify those failures, those mistakes, and reorder them. Also in a previous discussion, you mentioned about how Chinese history has been rebranded or invisibilized. You use that as a verb in the past. What do you think? It relates to this glitch concept, but what aspects of Chinese history specifically are you thinking about when you say that?
Well, actually, I was thinking a lot more about China virus, you know, the phrase of China virus, and how it's a propaganda. You know, rebranding is, I guess I was using that as a polite way of describing propaganda. And then invisibilizing is the lack of representation. You know, the lack of representation of the diaspora and of the histories that they have contributed to, and the value that they've added to culture. You know, and also the opportunity of creating those bridges of understanding as well, as opposed to, I understand that museums have to sort of go for the big ticket sort of shows, etc., the spectacles, and you know, to get the footfall into, you know, there are many pressures that I wouldn't understand what a museum would have to you know, fulfill. And but I feel that their role is also as an important, you know, space and forum for education. And what better sort of like, you know, group of community can help bridge, like I said, I keep saying these bridges of understanding, you know, these conduits of knowledge, etc. You know, are those that are in between. You know, they are, you know, able to understand, you know, both sides and belong to both at the same time. They already, you know, literally, you know, bridge those cultures.
Yeah, and making it visible is one big step, and we're in the visual arts, right? So it's a way of visualizing what.
Yeah, and it should be complex, you know, it's because we are complex, you know, as well. It shouldn't be afraid of such the diversity of humanity. You know, it's this is who we are, you know, and what better place to express that than through these fantastic institutions, you know, that have this enormous platform and power to be able to change the narratives, you know, of our cultures and of our national identities, you know, of the population's mindset. You know, it's a huge amount of influence that they wield. You know, and this is a perfect timing in order to do that. You know, because of the dangers of what, you know, the president is advocating, you know, for, with the type of rhetoric that he's trying to create, this kind of black and white sort of issue, with no gray, spectrum between, in order to, it's an either or, you're either against us or with us mentality. And this is extremely divisive and damaging, especially when blame is portioned onto a minority, of a nation, and the result being a spike in hate crimes.
I think that's one of the strongest pitches for exhibiting more works by Asian diaspora artists I've ever heard, to raise awareness and to really be able to pinpoint the nuances of all the different things without having to be so black and white about it. Art has a wonderful way of being able to be a bit ambiguous and a bit more open. And as you were saying, we're imperfect. So let's use art as a tool to be able to exalt those imperfections.
Yeah. I do want to mention also, in the UK at the moment, there is actually a show of Chinese diaspora artists at the CFCCA in Manchester right now. So there are, their remit is it involves having to do that as part of their core beliefs. There are moments.
No, of course, and I don't think it's something that has been completely ignored. But I think a lot of perception also on who the patrons are. A lot of the patrons are Chinese, so then they might focus on Chinese art rather than Chinese diaspora art to attract those larger patrons and donors from China. Do you think that there is also a community of sponsors and donors coming together for China, for Asian diaspora in general, but specifically Chinese diaspora art?
No, I don't think so. I think there are people who collect specifically Chinese American or maybe Chinese. They may not be always called Chinese diaspora, because art from Taiwan is often not. Is totally different, on opposite side of the spectrum from art from China, and that's technically diaspora, right? I don't think that the term Chinese diaspora, I don't think is used often enough to describe our group. We're often called overseas Chinese. We're often called Asian Americans, British-born Chinese. We have all these different names, but it's about the general just diaspora, in that Chinese is a cultural belongingness. It's not a political group, or we're not all the same. Bottom line.
I think that that's a really nice note to end our conversation on, and to just highlight the fact we're not all the same. We have to acknowledge these different discussions and make sure that that there is the nuance in the vocabulary we use, and an acknowledgement of these communities, and an awareness of how the language that's being used has an effect on the wider ecosystem. I really enjoyed speaking to both of you today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think we have a to-do list. We're going to be putting together some resources for everyone who attended the webinar, in case you want to read more. And we can also share a link to Gordon's work as well. And I think it would be fantastic that if this discussion triggers more people to think about this in a different context, and to really question their own biases. Were there any last thoughts you'd like to share before closing the conversation?
I think this resource page, we'll probably put it on our website as well, so people can go to icfac.org to take a look. And I believe we recently uploaded a few more exhibitions to Vastari for Gordon Cheung. So please take a look. And thank you so much, Bernadine, for hosting this, and Vastari as well.
Oh, great. We really enjoyed it, and look forward to hearing the effects of this conversation, and hopefully lots of people will look at your exhibitions on Vastari as well. Very good. Have a great evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. And thank you again, Inez and Gordon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And to everybody that came as well.
Yes, the amazing number of participants.
Thank you.